Okay, let's get started. Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to the uni and welcome to Intermediate Macro. You all have taken Introductory Macro. There you learn the basic concepts in macroeconomics. You know that macroeconomics is all about the aggregate economy, right? So what we'll do in Intermediate Macro is that we'll provide you with a deeper and broader coverage and understanding of our macroeconomy. We'll give you a brief review of what we will do throughout the semester, and hopefully you find macroeconomics interesting and useful. A brief introduction of the general subject. My name is Mei, and I'm the subject coordinator. Here you have my office hours on every Tuesday and Wednesday. You have my office location, phone number, and email address. If you have a question and you don't have time during my consultation hour, it's fine, send me an email, you can make an appointment. Our tutor coordinator this year is Vasana. If you have any issues related to tutorials or any admin side of the subject, please send her an email. Notice that her email address is a bit different, this one. Please mention the subject you're referring to. In our case is Intermediate Macro, because she coordinates multiple subjects. If you send email to her about your tutorial issues or other admin issue related to this subject, you can send Vasana email, but be sure to mention the subject that you're referring to. Now, the textbook that we will use is this textbook, the 4th edition, Australian Asian edition, Macroeconomics by Blanchet and Shin. This book was first published in 2013, and it hasn't been updated yet. Someone asked me if you can use the previous edition, like the 2nd or 3rd edition. My answer is yes, but you should be careful, because with the 4th edition, the authors, they rearrange some chapters. The page numbers wouldn't be the same as the previous edition. So if you do use the previous edition, be sure to find the correct reading, because for every lecture, we'll refer you to the reading in the textbook, and just be sure you find the right part of reading in your previous edition of the textbook. And also, the new edition has a bit more coverage of the recent global financial crisis. If your old textbook does not have this, you can go to the library, check out the new edition, and get your reading there, all right? Just make sure you catch up with the reading if you use the previous edition of our textbooks. So the main course materials include the following. I have uploaded the subject guide online, and if you check it last Friday, I actually updated on Monday. There's one thing I updated. I'll let you know in next slide. But now the subject guide on LMS is the final version. I wouldn't change it anymore. It has all the basic information about our subject, including assessment, tutorials, and all the information. And if you have any inquiry, check the subject guide first. And if you can't find an answer, you can email me or Vasana. The other part of the subject is the tutorial. You have taken the 1st and 2nd year core subject in economics. You know we have this so-called blue sheet, pink sheet system, or now we might call it in-tutorial, pre-tutorial system. What is it is, some of you may or may not like it. This is a system where we have 2 sets of questions. The blue sheet ones, we call it blue sheet because we used to distribute this a week ahead in tutorial to students in previous years, but now we want to go paperless. That's why this is not going to be distributed to you in tutorials anymore. Rather, we'll post it on LMS a week ahead of your tutorial. So these are the questions that you're supposed to work on before your tutorials. So these are the questions that will test your basic understanding of your knowledge. And as you work on these questions, you should expect you should be able to work on most of these questions. These are the blue sheet questions. And there is another set of questions which we also call the in-tutorial questions. We call it pink sheet questions because this will be given to you in tutorials, and It will be printed in pink color paper. We call it pink sheet questions. These questions, you will try them in tutorial. Your tutor will give you the question, and you work on these questions for maybe 10, 15 minutes, and then your tutor will focus on explaining pink sheet questions in your tutorial. The purpose of this blue sheet and pink sheet system is that you work on the blue sheet questions. These are more basic questions you are supposed to know. And tutors, they'll explain more deeply of the pink sheet questions. And also, we'll provide you with the solution to blue sheet questions a week after the tutorial, but you will never get solution to pink sheet questions. So this is something that some of you don't like. So why can't you get all the solution? And we have a long story why we have this system, but to summarize, the purpose is to let you have some kind of exam environment in each tutorial. You get a question, think hard, work hard, and try these questions. And then you should be really focused in your tutorial to get this solution. What if you miss a tutorial? Well, you can either see your friend, if you have some friends in our class, or come to see your tutor, to see me, to see Vasana. You have various resources to get your answer for the pink sheet question, but we will never distribute the solution to pink sheet questions. So don't ask us to send you an email of the pink sheet solution. This is not going to happen. You have to be responsible for your pink sheet solution. And of course, an important part of the subject is the lecture slides. I'll provide it at least 24 hours in advance. Now, as we discuss tutorials, this is the most important part of our subject. And we encourage you to try the pre-tutorial question, the pink sheet question before tutorials, because tutors won't spend a lot of time on blue sheet questions, although you will get the solution, but it's better you try these questions before you see the solution, right? And if you have any trouble, talk with your friends, or you can also ask online tutor, because this is a big subject. We have online tutor. You can ask certain questions to online tutor, but we encourage that you don't ask every detailed question to online tutor. Think before you ask. So online tutor cannot really answer 10 questions from everyone each day. So think about what you want to ask. This is another source for you to ask questions. These give you the logistic of the tutorials. If you have trouble registering tutorial, you can go to that system. Further problem, go to step 1. And lastly, you can contact Vasana, our tutor coordinator. Now, this is the part we are interested in, assessment. The final assessment has several parts. We have an online multiple choice, which will take place from August 28th to August 29th. The online multiple choice test will cover the materials that we learn from week 1 to week 4, the first 2 topics, as I'll show you. And the purpose of this online multiple choice test is basically to see if you are following our subject, right? We don't want you to be left behind. So this is a first test to see if you are following well of our subject. That accounts for 5% of the final assessment, 5%. You spend half an hour during that time to sit before your computer and finish this online multiple choice test. We'll give you more detailed information as we get close to the online multiple choice test. We have 2 assignments. Each accounts for 12.5% towards the final assessment, 12.5%. And both assignments are group assignments. I'll give you more details of the groups in next slide. And tutorial participation accounts for 10% of final assessment. How to get that 10%? Well, if you regularly attend your tutorial, tutors will prepare a list, and you regularly attend. They'll tick your name. And in that case, you get 5% of tutorial participation. The other 5% is we want you to participate actively in tutorials. We don't want you to just sit there and listen. We want you to be a little bit more proactive, be active in your tutorial. This 5% will be given by your tutors. So your tutor has the discretion to give you that extra 5%. Total tutorial participation is 10%. Lastly, final exam accounts for 60% towards final assessment. And final exam covers everything we talk about from today till the last week, the last lecture. It's cumulative. Now, about group assignments. As I said, it's group assignment, and what's the rule to form a group? Basically, you can form a group up to 3 people in the same tutorial, and you'll be given the same mark. And the only thing is that you don't need to be in a group. If you feel that you really want to work it on by yourself, it's fine. You can do it by yourself. But if you do want to have a group, but you don't know anyone yet, don't worry too much. You can ask your tutor to form a group for you, because tutors usually love to play this type of matchmaking. You can check with your tutor. Exam is 60% towards final assessment. The style of exam will be given to you before the final exam. Like, we'll give you some sample past finals. You see exactly what the final exam look like. 20 marks go to multiple choice questions, and 40 marks go to essay questions. You see exactly what the final exam look like. We'll give you the sample final probably in week 11 or week 12 at that time. Now, this is probably the most important thing in lecture 1, hurdle requirement. So this is something our department just started implementing this year. Every subject in economics has a hurdle requirement. What does it mean? It means that if you want to pass this subject, you have to pass the final exam. It also means that you have to get at least here 30 marks in your final exam to pass the subject. In the past, this does impact you, because in the past, you know that we have 40% of assessment go to assignments and online multiple choice, all these different things. And like students, some of them, they literally can get only like 15 marks in final exam, and they can pass the subject. And this is something we don't want in the department. We want you to show your true understanding of this subject, and final exam is probably one good way to test it. That's why we have the hurdle requirement. And in semester 1, we did have a major change after implementing this. So now, please make sure you understand this hurdle requirement. Please work hard towards your final exam. It's not enough you only have the assignments done and you have the multiple choice test done. You have to have the 50% of your final exam to pass this subject. That's the hurdle requirement. Okay, so let me give you a brief introduction of what we'll cover throughout the semester. We have a few topics that we want to cover in intermediate macroeconomics. We'll start from the short-run macroeconomics. We'll begin with a closed economy. Just imagine in the world there is only one country, no export, no import, a very simple start, a closed economy. We start from the short run. Why the short run? Well, in the short run, we generally focus on the demand side of the economy. That is, we view that aggregate economic outcome is determined by fluctuations in aggregate demand. And there we'll discuss the ISLM model. This is something new that you didn't learn in your first year introductory macro. We developed the ISLM model to study the short-run macroeconomy. We'll spend week 1 to week 3 on this ISLM model. And the second topic is a special aspect of the short-run macroeconomics. This is the labor market fluctuation. We spend a week, 2 lectures on this particular topic. And then the online multiple choice test will cover these 2 topics. And the thing that I changed in the syllabus or subject guide lately was actually the time of this online multiple choice test. If you did check the version that I uploaded last Friday, it is a different time. I moved it to a later time because I want to ensure everybody finish tutorial in week 5 so that you have equal coverage of the last topic, here the labor market topic, before you attempt the online multiple choice test. So this time, August 28th to August 29th is the time for online multiple choice test. It covered the first 2 topics in the first 4 weeks. After learning the short run macroeconomy, we move on to the medium run. There, we look at both aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So we bring the supply side of the economy in, and there we'll begin with the static version of the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, which is similar to what you learn in introductory macroeconomics. But we only spend like 1 lecture on that. What we spend most time on is a kind of extended version of the static aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. We call it dynamic aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. Here, we actually deviate from the textbook. We'll rely on 1 chapter from another textbook, Mancune's textbook, and you'll be given an electronic copy of that particular chapter when we go through that topic. And some students in the past kind of comment, this is probably one of the most difficult model you learn throughout the semester, this dynamic aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. And indeed, assignment 1 will be about this particular model. But I find generally after doing assignment 1, students get really familiar with this model. In the end, you might like it. So this is one model that you keep an eye on. It could be quite challenging when you first see it. After learning the medium run macroeconomics, we move on to the very long run of our macroeconomy. There, we actually ignore the demand side. Rather, we think supply side is more important. That is productivity, capital accumulation, all these issues are more important. And there, we learn the solo growth model. I know you know the basic solo growth model from introductory macro, but here we'll extend what you learn in first year and give you more like versions, including endogenous growth and human capital accumulation, like various versions of the solo growth model. And after that, we'll move on from a closed economy to an open economy, because we know every country does trade with the other countries nowadays, right? So a closed economy is one simple assumption, but at some point, especially when you're interested in international trade, export, import, or exchange rate, all these issues, you have to think about open economy. This is exactly what we want to do in topic 5. We'll look at open economy macroeconomics. There, we discuss the concepts of exchange rate, real exchange rate, nominal exchange rate. We also developed the Mundell-Fleming model to see how exchange rate is determined in the economy. So that's the last topic. And we'll end our lecture with a special discussion on macroeconomic policy in lecture 23. And the last lecture will be spent on a review of what you learned throughout the semester. So that's the plan for the whole semester. As I said, I hope you find macroeconomics useful and fun. What we'll do in the rest of today's lecture is that we'll provide you with a brief review of what you learn in introductory macroeconomics. It's more like a refresh of your memory. This shouldn't be something very new to you. You should feel quite comfortable seeing all this stuff. We'll review 3 key concepts in macroeconomics. We'll use these concepts again and again. These are aggregate output, inflation, and unemployment. As I said, this is more like a review. You should feel quite relaxed and just refresh of your memory. First, aggregate output. Well, aggregate output is something to measure aggregate economic activity. It is generally measured in national income accounts. What is national income accounts? You should have heard about it in introductory macro, right? This is an accounting system that records an economy's production and income. We won't go into details of what these national income accounts look like. Just to let you know, the United States started using these national income accounts to record production and income after the Second World War, whereas Australia started doing this from the 1960s. Nowadays, it's quite common, like countries use national income accounts to record production and income. And by construction on national income accounts, you can calculate aggregate output either from the production side or the income side. So some of you may learn accounting, you know, there is this magic with accounting, right? You always have like 2 ways to do it. By construction, they should give you the same number. Here, you can calculate aggregate economic activity from the production side. This gives you the gross domestic product from the production side. Alternatively, you can calculate GDP, aggregate economic activity, from the income side. That gives you the gross domestic income. By construction, these 2 measures should give you the same number. And notice that GDP or GDI is a flow variable. What does it mean? It means it measures aggregate economic activity within a certain period. If you look at the data on GDP, you should look like, is it like GDP per year, that's like annual GDP, or GDP per quarter, that would be quarterly GDP, or maybe GDP per month, that would be monthly GDP, right? So GDP or GDI, this type of aggregate output measure, is a flow variable. We should specify the time period, like the time interval we look at, right? Now, there are generally 3 ways to calculate GDP. If you measure GDP from the production side, you can either calculate the total value of final, here this is the key word, final goods and services produced in an economy during a certain period. What does it mean by final? For a lot of production, we know that it takes some intermediate input, right? Like our example in next slide, we have car company and steel company. To produce cars, we need steel. So steel would be like intermediate input, right? It's intermediate product. If you calculate GDP using the first way, the total value of final goods and services, we shouldn't include intermediate input. Alternatively, you can also calculate total value added. What is value added? Value added refers to at each step of production, what is the extra value like this production brings in, right? We'll give you a specific example in next slide to show you what we mean by value added. But no matter you use method 1 or method 2, you get the same number of GDP. They should give you the same number. And method 3 is when we calculate GDP from the income side, it's also fine. You can calculate aggregate income, total income in an economy during a certain period. This also gives you a measure of aggregate output. Now, what do we mean by all this method 1, 2, 3? Here is one good example. Now, in this example, in a very simple economy, we have 2 companies, the car company and the steel company. The car company produce cars and steel company produce steels. In this economy, steel company has sales revenue $100, and $80 go to workers who work in the steel company, that $80 wage payment. And the rest $20 will be going to the steel company owners, right? The owner of the steel company as profits. What about the car company? Well, to produce cars, you need to buy steels as intermediate input. And in this case, the car company spent $100 as expenditure to buy steel from the steel company. And total sales revenue here is $210. $70 go to wage payment for workers who work in the car company. The rest, $40, is the profit accrued to the firm owner of the car company. So this is the setup of this simple economy. Now, how can we use the 3 methods to calculate GDP then? Well, let's look at the first method, the total value of final goods and services. So which good is the final good in this economy? Cars, right? Steel is the intermediate input, right? Because to produce cars, you need steels. So that means use method 1. Let's try it. What's the total value of cars here? That's this 210, right? So this gives us the total GDP in this economy, 210. We look at only final goods, cars. We can ignore steel because it's in the intermediate input. Now, let's try the second method. Have a check. What if we look at value added? Well, let's look at the production of steel. What is the value added by the steel company? Notice that steel company doesn't take into any intermediate input, right? It just produces steel. And what is the value added in this case? 100, right? That's basically the sales revenue generated by the steel company. So the second method, that's value added 100. Then the tricky part is for car company. What is the value added generated by the car company? Well, the car company produced a total sales revenue 210, but is all this 210 generated by the car company? No, right? Because 100 is from the steel company. That's why if you calculate value added by the car company, we should take out the production of steel, right? Because this is not done by the car company. That's why we do that. We are left with 110. That's the value added by the car company. And the total value added would be, you add up 100, that's by the steel company, and 110, that's by the car company. You have 210. Not too bad, we have 210 again. So these two measures give us the same aggregate output, 210. Now, the third measure, what if we look at total income? This is a harder one because to look at total income, we first need to find who owns income in this economy, right? And of course, it is apparent from this table here. We have workers who work in the steel company. We also have workers who work in the car company. So presumably, these workers should be someone we consider when we calculate total income. But who else? Firm owners of car company and steel company, right? So look at who own the income in this economy. $80 go to workers in the steel company. $20 go to the firm owner of the steel company. And $70 go to workers in the car company. The rest, $40, go to the firm owner of the car company, right? So these are the income owner, like those who own income, who earn income in this economy. And then the last step for us is to add up all this income and see if it's 210. Is it? So we have 80 plus 20, that's 100. 70 plus 40, that's 110. Add them up. It's again 210, right? So that shows no matter which method you use, you can look at the total value of final goods and services. You can also look at the total value added, or you look at total income. It should give you the same number, same measure of aggregate output. In our example, it's 210, right? Now, question for you is, think about, in our example, steel company has a sales revenue 100, and car company has a sales revenue 210. Can I say that the car company is like twice as large as the steel company? Can I say that? Like if you read newspaper, it mentioned like company A has sales revenue of blah, 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 and can we say that this is a big company based on the sales revenue? Now you learn macroeconomics, you have a better understanding of it, right? We can't really look at the sales revenue to measure the size of a company, right? What we should look at here should be the value added. The value added by the car company is 110. The value added by the steel company is 100. We can't judge the size of a company merely by the size of sales revenue, right? Just one comment here. Now, two more comments on this measure of aggregate output, GDP. One is that if you think about what we measure is aggregate production, right? How many products do we produce in one economy? Countless, right? Apples, bananas, oranges, everything. But how can we add apples with bananas? Can we? Does it make sense to add these goods together? Probably no, right? These are different units. You can't add up a computer with an apple. So how to do it? That's why, like, you notice that we have so many products in the economy. To calculate aggregate GDP, we actually use the market price here to So we use the market price to measure these, to add up all these goods together. That is, we use the production times the price. That's how we can add up all different goods together, use the price, right? The second is, you may think that having a higher GDP is a good thing, right? After all, if you look at like discussion today in the newspaper or magazines, you say like US is a like big advanced economy because it has a very large GDP, right? It seems that having higher GDP is a good thing, but be careful. GDP is something that measures aggregate economic activity, that's all. It is not equivalent to standard of living or well-being, right? What happened is during war times, like the Second World War or the First World War, normally countries that suffer war have high GDP. Why? Because there's a lot of government expenditure on armies, on weapons. But it doesn't mean that people live a better life during wartime, right? So this aggregate GDP is just a measure of aggregate economic activity. It's certainly not equivalent to standard of living or well-being, right? We'll have more discussion of that when we go to the growth topic. But for now, remember, it's a measure of aggregate economic activity, nothing more. So we talk about using price to measure GDP, and the next question we want to ask here is, which price to use? Well, if you use the current price, that is, if you use quantity times the current price, in this case, when we calculate GDP, we call it nominal GDP. Like, that is, if you calculate GDP in Australia, say for the first half of the year in 2017, you use the price in 2017 and use the quantity, times them together, and add up all goods. That will give you the nominal price. However, sometimes we have a problem. If you want to compare, say, aggregate economic activity between 2017 and, say, 1960, shall we look at nominal GDP in 2017 and 1960? Is that a good idea? Just let's find GDP in 1960 and then compare it with 2017. Would you believe that's how economic activity changed over time? Is there a problem? Right, exactly, price, right? Because from 1960 to 2017, if you think about it, of course, aggregate production expand, but what about the price level? If we use the current price, we haven't been able to control for the price level. So merely comparing nominal GDP across different time doesn't give you the precise comparison between aggregate economic production between the two times, right? Rather, that's why we introduced the concept of real GDP. This is where we take the sum of quantities times a constant price. We want to use a constant price to control for the price level. And normally, if you choose a constant price, you have to choose a price in a certain year, and this certain year is called a base year. And in the base year, by definition, real GDP equals nominal GDP, right? Now, to test your understanding of real GDP and nominal GDP, look at this figure here. Here we have the Australian nominal GDP and real GDP from 1960 all the way to 2010. This blue one gives you the real GDP and gray one gives you nominal GDP. Vertical axis is billions of dollars. It's measured in dollars. Now, can you tell me which year is the base year when we calculate real GDP here? Can you tell? Come on, yesterday someone got it. 2009, right? It's about that here. Why? Because in the base year, real GDP should, by definition, equals nominal GDP. You can tell from this plot that the intersection of nominal GDP and real GDP give us the base year that we use to calculate real GDP. This is 2009 here. And you can't see it from the plot, but I can tell you, if you look at nominal GDP from 1960 all the way to 2011, Australian nominal GDP increased by 83 folds. That's a lot, 83 folds. But if you look at real GDP, the real GDP, which actually measures the size of aggregate production, increased by about 6 times. So where is the rest of the increase? From the price level, right? If you look at nominal GDP and real GDP, you know why we need real GDP to measure the actual aggregate production, not nominal GDP, right? So that's all about aggregate output. The second concept that we want to discuss or reveal is inflation. What is inflation? Inflation refers to sustained increase in the general price level, and the inflation rate is normally calculated as the percentage change in the price level. And when we talk about inflation, there's another side of it. If the price keeps increasing, we have inflation. What if price keeps decreasing? In that case, we call it deflation. It is relatively rare to observe deflation in the real world, but it happens. For example, during the Great Recession, we have some deflation, and more recent example is Japan. Japan experienced a longer period of recession and deflation after the 1990s. It's relatively rare, but it happens, deflation. Now, if we want to calculate inflation or deflation, this is like the percentage change in the price level. We need to have a good measure of price level, right? Well, if you say like the price of a computer or the price of my jacket, it's easy, it's just one product. But we have so many different products in the economy. Like how can we calculate the general price level in this case? Well, economists construct price index in this case. The two most common useful price index that we use or we look at, one is called the GDP deflator, and the other is called the consumer price index. The difference between these two price index is the basket of goods that we consider. We consider different baskets of goods. We first look at GDP deflator. GDP deflator is defined as the following. You have a nominal GDP where you use quantities times current price and add up all the goods in a time period T. And also you can choose a base year and calculate real GDP in time period T. Now, the GDP deflator is defined as the nominal GDP over real GDP times 100. The question here is, do you know what is the GDP deflator in the base year? So 100, right? It's an index, so we kind of scale up it by 100. By definition, the GDP deflator in the base year is the GDP deflator in the base year is 100. So what does this measure? This price index basically measures the general price level of all the goods that are produced within a country, right? This is the GDP deflator. The Australian GDP deflator measures the general price level of all the goods produced within Australia. Whatever GDP includes, this price index includes. That's the basket of goods this price index considers. Now, a second one, which is probably more relevant for us, is called the consumer price index. This price index measures the average price of a consumption basket. Where does this consumption basket come from? Normally, the Australian Bureau of Statistics conducts survey. It's called Consumer Expenditure Survey. They do the survey every once in a while to see what kind of goods a typical Australian consumer consume, construct the weight of this basket. And this consumer price index also gives us a measure of the price level. Now, can you think of something that's, say, in the consumer price index, but not in the GDP deflator? Can you think of something? Yeah, exactly, imports. So my example I often use is like, for example, iPhone, right? It is something a lot of us are using. I'm using an iPhone, and a lot of you are using iPhone. So So this is something Australians import from other countries. This is not going to be in the GDP deflator when we think about the price index. But iPhone, certainly it will be considered in the consumer price index because this is what typical Australians consume every day, right? So if you think about a change in price level of iPhone, it will certainly impact CPI, but not GDP deflator, right? That shows these two price index, they measure different basket, the price level of different baskets of goods. Now, of course, because there is a great overlap between the stuff we produce and the stuff we consume, you often observe the GDP deflator and CPI, they co-move. And this is an example. This plot gives you the inflation rate measured by either GDP deflator or CPI for Australia from 1960 to 2011. And you see the gray one is the inflation based on the GDP deflator, whereas CPI inflation based on CPI is given by the blue one. See, they co-move a lot, right? No matter which index, price index you use to calculate inflation, you get very similar measure. But observe in recent decades, here, we have a larger divergence between these two inflation measures, right? See the recent divergence? Now, after learning the difference between CPI and GDP deflator, can you explain why we have this recent divergence? What could be a possible explanation? Do you buy a lot of stuff from US or China or India? Like, do foreign people consume a lot of our Australian goods? Probably yes, right? As globalization is it's affecting us more and more. That's why you see a divergence between CPI inflation and GDP deflator inflation. That's because the basket we consume, the CPI index, and the basket we produce in Australia, the GDP deflator one, become more different these days, right? That means we probably import and export more these days compared to, say, 50 years ago. That explains the divergence between inflation measured by CPI and GDP deflator. So the last concept we want to review is unemployment. We first give you the definition of unemployment. How do we define unemployment? Well, we use this capital letter N to denote the number of people employed, like me, in the economy. And we use capital letter U to denote the number of people who are unemployed in an economy. And then we define the sum of these two here as the labor force. The number of people that are in the labor force is defined as employed plus unemployed. Now, the unemployment rate is then defined as the ratio of unemployed over the labor force. So for people like you, most of you don't have a job, right? But are you unemployed? Are you part of unemployed population in Australia? Probably no. Why? Because there's another concept, labor force participation. If you're unemployed, you should be unemployed and you should also be actively looking for a job. That's the definition of unemployed. So for people like you who don't have a job and who are not looking for a job, you are not in the labor force. So you're not in this big L here. And we have another measure called participation rate here. That is the size of the labor force L divided by the civilian population. That's the working age population in Australia. So this gives us the labor force participation rate. So you are not part of the labor force. Most of you here are not part of the labor force, but you belong to civilian population. What about Australia? This is the number I got 2 years ago in 2015. Labor force is about 12.5 million people in Australia, employed 11.7 million, unemployed 0.76 million. Then you can calculate unemployment rate, which is this number of unemployed over the size of labor force, about 6%. So Australia has maintained relative low unemployment rate, especially during the global financial crisis. If you have an interest in the current global economy, you know in a few European countries such as Spain or Portugal, they actually suffer very high unemployment rate a few years ago. It could be as high as 25%. It means that out of every 4 people, 1 person is unemployed in the labor force. Participation rate in Australia is given by the size of labor force, this is this big L, over the civilian population, that's 19.28, about 65%. Participation rate is not something that we are going to spend a lot of time on, even in week 4 when we discuss unemployment. But this is something that economists actually do a lot of research on. You can imagine that this participation rate also fluctuates over time. For example, after the Second World War, there's a lot of female labor participation, so the participation rate increased a lot after the Second World War. And recently, a lot of countries have this aging problem. Now, can you imagine the implication for labor force participation? Probably we have less of a labor force, right? So this labor force participation also vary over time. This is the plot of Australian unemployment rate over time from 1960 to 2010. You see there are fluctuations. It goes up to as high as 11%, as low as 2%. We'll spend 2 lectures on this unemployment rate fluctuation. We'll develop a particular model to understand these fluctuations. The last thing that we want to discuss today is about this unemployment, the definition. I mentioned briefly that unemployment is defined as people who are not working, who don't have a job, but who are actively looking for a job. So this is hard to get statistically, right? If you think about it, how can I, just by observing each of you, how can I know if you're actively looking for a job or not? How do we get these statistics is, again, Australian Bureau of Statistics, they conduct this labor force survey. The sample now is 42,000 Australian households. Every once in a while, they ask a series of questions. For example, they ask you, have you been working in the past month? And if you are not working, have you been looking for a job? So they ask all these detailed behavioral questions as well. If you are not working and you're saying that you're actively looking for a job, you are then classified as unemployed. Only in this case, you're part of the unemployed pool. Otherwise, like people like you, if you say you're not working and you're not looking for a job, you're not in the labor force, right? So that's all about unemployment, inflation, and aggregate output. Notice for you guys, your second lecture is tomorrow because we want to maximize enrollment number so that we switch the venue of Thursday and Friday class. And then for stream 2, you guys, the lecture 2 is tomorrow in this classroom. Do you know that? Does it show on your study plan? Right? Okay. So I'll see you guys tomorrow. We'll begin with the ISLM model.
Lecture recording stuff like all of us, because there's a kind of class the whole week.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
A week after, or just.
No, I think it's usually available just a day or 2 after the lecture.
Since I didn't find a button of lecture recordings.
There should be, because Vasana told me she activates the lecture recording button. You can double check, and I'll also check. If not, we'll activate it. It's recorded for sure.
And one more question. I haven't taken intermediate micro. Would it be huge
No, because intermediate micro is not a prerequisite of this one, so probably only at one point we'll work on one maximization problem, but it's not intermediate micro related. It's more like you need a little bit of math background to work on it. But you should be fine. Every year there are students who take intermediate macro before intermediate micro. Yeah. It's not a big issue.
I was wondering, the lecture slide where we calculate the aggregate output, is there a way of calculating by expenditure?
Oh, we tried both. Like the first two, the value added and final goods and services is from the expenditure side. Oh, yes, from the production side. Yeah.
In this income side?
Income side. I think we'll actually talk about it in next lecture, where we say that look at aggregate demand, like from the expenditure side, different category like consumption, expenditure, government spending, that type of.
But in that example.
No, we didn't have all these different categories. If you really want, I think those would belong to. No, which does it belong? Consumption, maybe cars. Like the way we did it is not the same as what we'll discuss in tomorrow's lecture. There you see, like by expenditure, we have different categories, but in our simple example, there is actually, in some sense, there is only one expenditure. There is like car consumption. Right? We don't have government, we don't have net export, and there is no investment. So there is only one category of expenditure in some sense. But that's a good question. Oh, Finn?
Yeah.
Oh.
I'm more interested.
You're still worried about it. It's fine.
Yeah, okay. No, I was just going to say, would it be much better
No. Actually, the other girl just asked me, you are not the majority simply because the normal sequence is that you have semester one first, semester two second, right? But there are always like mid-year intake students. There is only one point. I feel probably you are a little better off if you have more like intermediate micro knowledge. But it's not really about intermediate micro. It's more about optimization and that type of math thing. But really only 1 or 2 points. So macro, it's basically when we go later to the solo growth model, we want to derive some optimal saving rate, and there you want to know how to find the maximum of a function. And we also touch a bit of production, marginal product of labor, marginal product of capital, this type of thing. So that might be related to what you learn in intermediate micro, but not essential. No. If that's the case, we should definitely put it as prerequisite. Don't worry. But like, if you do feel something that you want more help, or you can ask tutor or me. We'll be happy to provide the help. Right, it's okay. Yeah. No. 10, the same time. Same time, same venue. Oh, I see. Right. I mean, before and normally we should have